My name is Zazan Namoradze. I'm a director of Berlin office of the Open Society Justice Initiative, which is part of the Open Society Foundations, a global philanthropy. I'm really delighted to chair this panel, and I'm grateful to the Oacd to put on the agenda of this very important forum the topic on access to justice and how it is how to make it responsive to people's needs. I was just checking with Marcos Bunturi a few minutes before our session started, whether this may be the first occasion to really present access to justice at these and other similar forums, and it is indeed the case. Already this title of our panel suggests that there has been a fundamental problem with the justice system if we are talking about how to make it responsive to the people's needs, especially in modern times. This is a question that other social sectors have asked and maybe addressed and resolved a few decades ago, and justice system may be coming to that just now. The law underlines nearly every aspect of people's lives, including health, employment, education, entrepreneurship. Access to justice is central to advancing well-being and inclusive and sustainable development. Still, while this and other similar forums and platforms have been pushing boundaries of well-being measurement with the ultimate focus for policies and collective action to make improvements, access to justice and legal empowerment have been largely missing from these discussions. Other sectors have been using surveys and other measurement tools to understand people's needs and demand on sector. Justice sector, with the exception of few countries, is discovering it only now. Global turning point came in 2015 when all governments committed to SDG 16 and achieving equal access to justice for all by 2030. SDGs have never been more important than they are now. The SDGs, the goal 16 in particular, articulate a unified global vision for the future we want: more peace, more economic and social development that serve people, and advancement of rights and dignity of women and of excluded minorities. Core to this vision is the insight that justice and development are fundamentally linked. Broader and effective access to meaningful justice mechanisms are fundamental if we are to realize the vision of leaving no one behind. To realize it, there is a necessity to break out of the justice sector framing and instead look at the ways access to justice is critical to the other sectors. Effective access to justice helps resolve disputes at the heart of people's lives, promotes government accountability, and gives people and businesses confidence to enter into and enforce contracts. Far too long, access to justice meant access to courts and lawyers. Our understanding of the future, of the nature and impacts of the lack of access to justice is better now than ever. Legal needs survey methodologies are helping us understand frequent, pressing, and impactful legal problems. They have shown us that barriers to justice are not just a consequence, but also cause of poverty and inequality. Without meaningful access to justice, people are more likely to face problems with health, employment, housing, and education. Governments, businesses, and civil society organizations are using the knowledge combined with administrative and other data to develop effective responses and effective policies. In many jurisdictions, these solutions are already yielding positive results across a range of fields, from health and education outcomes to economic growth. So with today's session, Making the Justice System Responsive to People's Needs, we aim to present recent developments on the ways to better understand what people's needs and experiences are when dealing with legal problems and justice institutions, what impacts they have on people's lives, and how statistical measures of people access to justice have been shaping national policies and practices across sectors. At this session, we will also launch the publication, which was jointly produced by the OECD and OSGI. It's a guide to conducting legal needs surveys and for measuring access to justice. Let me introduce our speakers in the order of the speaking, also the way they're seated at this podium right now. Immediately next to my left is Nathalie Drouin, who is the Deputy Minister of Justice and the Deputy Attorney General of Canada, Justice Canada. Then Marcos Bonturi, who is the Director and OECD Public Governance Directorate. Pascal Pleasance, who is a Professor of Empirical Studies, University College London. Kim Yong-ji, Judge and Director of the Judicial Policy Office of the National Court Administration of the Republic of Korea. Isabel Schmidt, on his left, who is the Deputy, Isabel is the Executive Manager of Social Statistics of South Africa. And Jeff Mulherin, Director, New South Wales Law and Justice Foundation. So we'll start with a presentation by Nathalie, and I would like to in particular ask about Canada's experience of measuring justice and how those tools have helped the government to deliver justice services to people, and in what ways these measures can help also the governments to report on the progress of implementing SDG frameworks. Please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Zaza, for this introduction. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today. I really appreciate the conference so far, and I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to sit with very well-known people regarding when it comes to the justice system. When we talked about people's needs in the justice area, human rights are really the first needs that really come to mind. So I would like to start my presentation to talk about the importance of measuring the success of a nation's ability to secure fundamental human rights, access to justice, and also the rule of law. So in Canada, as you may know, we do have the Charter of Rights, and the Charter really represents what Canadians are, and they really represent because they are seeing themselves reflected in that Constitution. So they know that their institution will protect and support them regardless of race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation. So without any proper foundations for upholding human rights, a nation cannot succeed protecting the rights of vulnerable and marginalized communities, no matter the initiatives they are putting in place. But having a charter is really nice, it's a key. But without the independence of the judiciary, and also the respect of the rule of law to properly enforce those rights, nothing will change on the ground. So respect of the rule of law, and we've heard about that a little bit this morning, and the independence of the judiciary is not something we should take for granted. We must be vigilant in promoting and also upholding both. When people don't trust the justice system and they don't trust that the system is there for them, they will find ways to go around the system. And this is exactly what happened with the Me Too movement. And if enough people go around the system is failing the people it was created to serve, and then social cohesion is threatened. In Canada, sometime too, our fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution are not always consistently applied. And an example in Canada is with respect with Indigenous people and our efforts to rebuild our relationship with Indigenous people. So while the Constitution is really clear that Indigenous people do have inherent rights, it has been true that sometimes those rights are not perceived and applied the same ways as other rights. And when that happened, thank God our independent Supreme Court was there to provide direction. And this is what I think the richness of Canada's judiciary as it represents an effective check and balance in our system. And the current government of Canada is committed to reversing this inequality. So then when measurements and data come to play, so without the ability to quantify inequalities that exist, we cannot fix what isn't working. So by knowing where the inequalities exist and having a clear picture of the stark realities they expose, we can better deploy resources and also focus our legislation aimed at fixing the root causes of those inequalities. In Canada, we have many mechanisms, and one that is already in place really allows us to capture such data. So in Canada, for instance, we do have national legal problem surveys. And this survey taught us that the most common problems Canadians faced relate to debt, employment, family, neighbors, and also discrimination. And from these findings, we can implement specific tools, as I said before, like outreach campaigns, policy initiatives, and even legislation that are tailor-made to specifically address the data tells us to do. But our ability to respond to the data will be measured only and will be effective only depending on how strong our partnership is. We can no longer afford to operate in silos, especially considering the complex ecosystem that our legal system represents. So to illustrate how the system is complex, let me just talk about the criminal justice system. The majority of the problem in the criminal justice system is the result of lack of investment in other areas, like health, for example, lack of resources regarding mental health and regarding addiction, lack of resources in housing, and lack of resources in education. Another example of measurement in Canada is also our gender-based analysis plus tool, which assess how women, men, and gender diverse people may experience government policies, programs, and legislative measures. And the plus in the tool means that we also assess the intersecting factors like race, ethnicity, religion, age, and mental and physical disabilities. Federal departments must demonstrate how they have taken into account all of these factors in any initiative advancing through parliamentary processes. Another example of how we respond to what we measure is the overrepresentations of Indigenous people in our criminal justice system as both victims and offenders. And this is really in contrast by the underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples as active interveners working throughout the justice system. Indigenous people are far more likely than any other Canadian to be victims of crimes and homicide, and are far more likely to be arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated. Indigenous people have an homicide rate that is nearly 7 times higher than that non-Indigenous people in Canada. And while Indigenous adults comprise 4.1% of Canada's population, they are represented as high as 27% in our federal custody, let alone our provincial custodies. The thing with measurement is that number, as you may know, don't often lie. And these really hard to believe figures illustrate the troubling realities of Indigenous people's negative interaction with the justice system. Again, this speaks to the importance of effectively measuring such tragic circumstances so that we can put targeted, as I said before, initiatives that really address the root cause. But sometimes, and we have talked about trust a lot this morning and yesterday, sometimes having the relevant data to demonstrate the needs for an intervention is not enough. So as policymakers, we need to develop a narrative to deconstruct the popular assumptions and bias. I will give you an example. We know, for example, that minimum mandatory penalties put our indigenous people more in custody. And we know that those measures, those very severe penalties, don't have the effects we were expecting. They are not deterrent, they are not reducing the criminal rates, and they are not also reducing recidivism. But, you know, populations still believe that it's the way to be tough on crime. So it's like a window dressing, and they feel comfortable with them. So it's really difficult for politicians to remove those mandatory, even though the data are very strong, that they don't have the effects we were expecting when previous government put them in place. So this is why, as policymakers, our role is to bring a narrative out there in the public domain. And while we develop solutions, we need also to work with the communities facing the issues. And this is how I think we can bring feelings, empathy, humanity that Her Royal Highness was talking about yesterday morning in her opening remarks. And our experience in Canada has shown that community-based solutions have better chance of success over the long term. So recently we have introduced, after a consultation process, very transformative legislation. Am I good with time? To address the overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. And finally, when we do introduce those initiatives, we have to measure the outcome, making sure that we reach the outcomes we were looking for. At the government level, we do have results report right now, and we update the report every 2 weeks to make sure that we achieve the priorities we have identified. So accountability, transparency is one way to make sure that you put in place the right things. In Canada, we also measure outcomes with the collaborations with provinces, territories, and also cities. And this is why it's so challenging to make sure that the data collection can be interconnected. And to succeed on that side, we also look to international community for partnership and inspiration. And our commitment to the Sustained Development Goals in Canada really embrace this agenda. And we do report also on all the goals, especially the Sustained Development Goal 16, which really talk about peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And we built on those Sustained Development Goals to also advance our own national agenda. And this is why in Canada we put in place a National Action Committee on access to justice, and we also develop our 9 goals to facilitate access to family and civil justice for our citizens. So I have scratched really the high surface of how Canada's Department of Justice attempt to measure Canadians' interaction with the justice system and how we have responded in terms of initiatives. And I would like to say that I think our role here this morning is to be ambassador with the rest of the communities working on well-being to make sure that justice has its place and that we all understand the interrelations between justice and the other factors to come with to a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for really presenting an experience of Canada, which demonstrate the commitment of really viewing justice as an important social service and a public good that is integral part of everything else that government is doing and it is for. And connecting to many important themes of this morning's the plenary on trust and inequalities, and then SDG frameworks. So it really gives me great pleasure to go to our next speaker, Carlos Bonturi. So about 2 years ago, I think, in the work of my organization, which has been committed to access to justice for many, many years, a significant development took place. That was for the OECD to embrace the concept of access to justice. It's the one thing when access to justice advocate what their what their mission is for, but really having the major development, economic growth organization embrace the notion of access to justice really created completely new opportunities for us. It really created this platform and many similar platforms to engage with the policymakers and practitioners in all other sectors of the government which are dedicated to the well-being and economic growth and development, which justice sector needs to be part of, but has not been. And with the help of the OECD, we are actually making progress in that regard. So it's a really great pleasure to introduce Marcos, who will also launch the joint publication. So one of the products of the 2-year partnership, and it's been really productive partnership, has been the publication which Marcos hand-delivered this himself, which came out of the printing just 2 days ago, Legal Needs Surveys and Access to Justice, which is the guide on how to really use that measurement tool in knowing about what people's needs are, how people experience justice systems, what are the impacts when they fail to seek justice, how it impacts all other sectors, and what are the ways in which some of the good solutions can be found. So Marcos will make the introductory remarks and then launch the publication, and then we will go afterwards to the person who actually spent a year drafting that publication. So we'll come to nuts and bolts of that. Marcos, thank you.
Thank you very much, Aja. Thank you for hosting us and organizing this panel. My life is made very easy to come after Natalie because Canada is probably one of the most advanced countries in the reflection about access to justice. So you've thought it through. It's very clear from your presentation, and beyond that, you're really helping us by taking a leadership role in the international dialogue on this. So Canada has been a great partner in this endeavor, and of course, Zaza and the Open Society Foundations. I think we have accomplished a lot in a very short period of time, but our work is not done yet. I think we're just starting. I think we need to keep it up as we move forward. Again, because Natalie has really covered the ground so well, perhaps I'll focus on a couple of points just to complement what she has said. First, where are we coming from the OECD perspective in this debate, and why it took us so long to catch up and put this on our agenda? I think in the past there had been a certain amount of reluctance from our member countries who represent governments to look too closely at the justice system, because they felt that the judiciary is an independent branch of governments, and we don't have the mechanism, the representatives of the judiciary. So it was a bit of a taboo, frankly, where our member countries didn't feel that was appropriate for an organization, an intergovernmental organization like ours, to go too deeply into this discussion. But then, of course, with the crisis 10 years ago, we started to look at the issue of inclusiveness, and we have developed this initiative for a policy action on inclusive growth. And very quickly, we identified access to justice as one area that is very relevant for the debate on inclusiveness, and we very clearly started developing the economic argument for increased access to justice by seeing, okay, well, very often if there's inequality in access to justice, that perpetuates a number of other inequalities. And you see very clearly vulnerable groups, or the indigenous groups in the case of Canada, but in some countries there's a gender bias on access to justice. no minorities in general. Then you have also, if you look at the company side, commercial law, in some countries you have unequal access to justice. If you look at the SMEs, vis-a-vis the large companies, also create some disparities and perpetuate some, I would say, competitive disadvantages that SME has, and the SMEs being the backbone of any market economy. I think it was very important that we start linking all those things together. So from that, and of course, not to mention with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and Natalie mentioned that briefly, is of course SDG 16.3, but this is very direct link. But you think of access to justice and the link to inequalities, it covers a whole range of Sustainable Development Goals, and how unequal access to justice can have effects on your access to health systems, to housing, to education, to employment. So through those channels, you see the importance of the subject. So a decision was made at the OECD, and of course I'm the Director of Public Governance. I can only support the decision that the whole discussion on access to justice became part of the governance part of the OECD. At the end of the day, is a governance issue, and if you think that if you approach justice services as a public service, which it is, and we start at the OECD, we have this OECD serving citizens framework, and very quickly you understand that it's the government's responsibility to provide public services, and those public services need to be designed in a way to meet the expectations and needs of citizens. And that includes in terms of access, in terms of responsiveness, reliability, quality. And if you transfer that to the justice sector, what it means is that the courts, the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, they all should reflect the interests and the needs of the users. And if they don't, now you have very clearly an economic impact. So that's how we now approach this, and the interest that you have seen from the OECD derives a little bit from that history and that evolution of the topic. It's still incipient, and I want to recognize it's still very much incipient, this work at the OECD, but there is very strong support. And I would say, thanks to Canada and other countries that are leading this debate, some of them sitting here around the table with us, you see more and more of a coalition, I would say, of countries which are helping us push this agenda forward. Another thing that I would like to mention, and as we started to bring this as a governance issue, we also see very clear links to the issue of trust. And I mentioned at the plenary just a couple of hours ago, the issue has been a gradual erosion of trust in institutions, including the justice system, by the way. But more equal access to justice is one of the elements also to regain that trust. And of course, with obvious consequences in terms of capacity of governments to reform and of course, economic growth. So I would say that's really the first point I wanted to make. Then also following on your lead, Zaza, and what Nathalie has said, the issue of measurement. You cannot manage it if you cannot measure it. That's really at the heart of what we do at the OECD. I mean, we provide evidence-based policy rather than policy-based evidence, which is unfortunately what you see in some places. But we need to provide the evidence. We need to put the evidence on the table. So we need to measure. And it's easier said than done. And I think lots of efforts have been made in this area. If you look at historically, the legal sector has not been the subject of a well-coordinated, well-grounded, robust evidence-based research and analysis. It's not really out there yet. So that's very, very clearly a need. And the idea is that we need to help, let's say, identify and implement very cost-effective strategies to obtain and sustain the evidence base in this area. So it's not a coincidence that we are doing this here in Korea today in the context of the forum, because this is really part of a measurement agenda that is about well-being, is about knowledge sharing, and it is very important for us. Thank you so much for those of you who are here with us today, that we're taking this debate to this broader discussion on the SDGs and how measurement is such an essential part of policymaking in this area. Now, last but not least, as Zaza has mentioned, this is, I would say, our first child of this excellent cooperation in terms of something that you can hold on your hands. This is a launch copy. This is an advanced copy of the survey on legal needs, survey and access to justice. And Pascal would, of course, say more about it, but I just want to highlight how important this is. We with Open Society Justice Initiative, again, a major partner in helping us advance this debate. And just a couple of years ago, we have established this platform to disseminate knowledge, experience, and innovation, I would say, for the transmission of best practices. Because what the OECD does is that we look at specific experiences, we try to identify what worked less well or didn't work, and then we try to distill best practices, and that's how we work in many policy areas. So in this case, on the accessibility to justice, we're trying to start transmitting those best practices. We have organized a number of meetings and workshops, of course, many discussions, but this is really the first time that we are putting something on paper, and I think that I see great potential for this work going forward. This is the product of a very large number of national surveys. I think we're about 50 national surveys, Pascal, if I'm correct, and many jurisdictions over a large number of years. I think we go back a couple of decades. And what this is we see this as an empirical tool, but also a strategic tool and a methodological framework to allow policymakers, and some of you sitting here around the table, but also the advocates, to understand progress towards access to civil justice. And the idea is to assist countries to develop, to administer, and use those legal needs surveys in a methodological way that is coherent across countries, across jurisdictions, so we can have more of a coherent approach going forward. From our side, again, when I say this potential of this, we from the OECD and with the support of OSF and a number of our member countries, we are very keen to work with a broad range of stakeholders and hopefully a number of jurisdictions to allow them to implement that I would say very innovative approach to surveys, to legal needs surveys. So I think as we move forward, I think we need to invest in building this knowledge base jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So again, very much looking forward to working with all of you, and of course with statistical offices. You have a major role to play for those of you who come from NSOs. Thank you very much, Zaza.
Thank you very much, Marcos. And this is really just the beginning of this work. There is a lot to be done. When you may remember that in the debates around what should be included in SDGs, there was a position that justice and access to justice did not belong there. You would remember that MDGs did not have that. And one of the arguments by those who said that it did not belong there was that it cannot be measured. So with this publication and some work that backs it up, but a lot of work to be done, we are actually making the case, and we're proving it that it actually can be measured, that it's being measured, as we've seen on the case of Canada, and we'll see on the experience of a number of other countries. And no one probably could better talk to this point than Pascal Pleasance, who has probably worked from the very, very beginning. You probably were part of the very first, or not the first legal needs measurement, pioneering this effort in mid-90s, and now it has more than 50 countries, or 50 studies in more than 30 countries, and many more to come. So, Pascal, it would be great to really understand what it is that we have learned from that, from this work, of this body of research conducted, and how it helps really the plan, the work going forward, that is relevant not only for justice, but really for delivery of other mandates in health and education and other sectors. So please.
Thank you, Zaza and Marcos also, and of course the OECD and Justice Initiative for supporting the production of this guide, which has provided an opportunity to distill. Thank you. Much knowledge that has derived from now more than 55 surveys across more than 30 jurisdictions over the last 25 years or so. And this is the first opportunity to bring that knowledge and understanding from running these many different surveys in many different jurisdictions, very different types of jurisdictions, to start to think about what constitutes best practice and what the potential and function of these instruments can be going forward in the context of, particularly in the context of the SDGs. So I think the best place to start is really by going right back to the beginning, and all of the speakers so far have pointed to the breadth of the law and the fact that we really do live in a law-thick world in which almost every aspect of our life, Marcus singled out health, housing, education, employment. To that we could add families, welfare. The list goes on and on. It extends across all our activities and so reaches across many of the SDGs beyond simply 16.3. But whilst the law is sort of all around us and provides a framework for much of our activity as individuals and also businesses and other organizations, it's difficult to have a grasp of the extent to which law provides an obstacle in people's lives and to the functioning of businesses. Because the easy measures, important though they are, that come from the visible parts of the justice system, the sort of top-down measures, if you like, are incomplete because, as the legal needs surveys have shown many times over now, relatively few problems that involve the law actually involve formal process. And only a minority will even have any contact with what we would recognize as being the justice system. So whilst administrative data is important in defining those formal aspects of the justice system and providing measures within those, what legal needs surveys are able to do is to explore the justice system and reveal people's experience of justice more broadly, beyond the view of the institutions. So legal needs surveys, to provide an introduction to them, essentially set out to investigate the experience of the problems that have a legal dimension. People will often not recognize this and will often not make any recourse to lawyers or legal processes, but nevertheless, the legal framework does exist, and sometimes recourse is necessary to it. But the legal needs survey is designed to investigate that experience from personal experience or from businesses. Initially, and if we go back a couple of decades, there were literally just a handful of surveys that had been conducted, and they tended to have been conducted in relatively rich countries with particularly established legal aid schemes. And they were originated primarily in order to inform policy detail, to see how the reach of a legal aid system, for example, might not be to the extent that was envisaged by those people who were designing the system. But more recently, increasingly, legal needs surveys have been conducted in developing countries to support more fundamental reform and the creation of institutions and the reform of institutions and services, and importantly services, to support individuals who are facing problems that have legal dimensions in order to be able to resolve them. So as I say, more than 55 surveys across more than 30 different countries over the past 25 years. So a wealth of experience. Common stories have emerged. And there are some subtle and important differences between countries, but some major themes have come through. And I'm very briefly going to set these out. The first is that legal problems are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're commonplace. We will all face them. However, there is, and this goes to this fundamental concept of equality, there is an inequality of experience of problems. And surveys have shown across many jurisdictions that it is disadvantaged groups who are particularly vulnerable to problem experience. And if you look not at individuals, but you look at businesses, and there have been a number of surveys specifically looking at businesses, then as Marcos suggested, SMEs have a particular vulnerability to problems. So why is this? Well, so there are some problems that are peculiar to disadvantage. So if somebody is requiring support from a welfare system, then problems that are associated with support from a welfare system can be encountered where they wouldn't otherwise. They have a different character, problems, for people who are disadvantaged, because there is a lesser capability to avoid and mitigate and resolve problems when they are encountered. And very importantly, these problems are not existing in isolation of all other aspects of people's lives. These problems are fundamentally connected to and impacting on other aspects of people's lives. So we find over and over that legal problems bring about problems in other domains, in the health domain, in employment, within families, leading to family breakdown. And this is a vicious cycle. And so the vulnerability to problems brings about impacts that then increase vulnerability to problems. So this is something that is really captured by the surveys that have been undertaken to date. But those people who experience problems, well, there is another level of inequality that then comes on top of that inequality of experience. Because there's an inequality of access to support services. Not everybody is equally able to access the support that they require. And then there's an inequality in capability, in the ability of people to be able to utilize services. So legal needs surveys then, they provide this picture, and they can provide measures of access to justice by defining the extent to which problems are experienced and the needs of the individuals who experience them. But they are complex research tools, and I say that having learned the hard way from having made many mistakes over the years, and that these are complex instruments. And so, as I say, it's been extremely valuable to be able to produce this report to condense and distill the many lessons that have come from the surveys over the years. So to briefly introduce the contents of the guide. First out, it sets to describe the background to the surveys, where they originated from, why they've been undertaken, and to provide some of this rich context of the themes, the findings that have emerged from the surveys, and the understanding that we now have of how justice issues are inextricably linked to that broad range of other issues that the SDGs more broadly are concerned with. And it then goes on to identify and present best practice. Setting out approaches to the concepts and means of measuring those key concepts within the domain, such as legal need, such as access to justice itself. And then the guide provides a series of model questions, core questions, and then sets these out within 2 model questionnaires as a resource, not intended to be something that you necessarily just take off the shelf, but as something that can be adapted to different contexts. And I'm not going to go through these next couple of slides in any detail, but this is just to give you a flavor of what is in the report. So there is taxonomy of the various concepts. So this screen is showing the different ways that you can define and categorize the many sources of help that people go to when faced with problems, because people go literally everywhere when faced with problems. And so we need to be able to conceptualize and categorize, and so this provides a framework for that, and also for processes, then the model questions are set out with explanations of exactly why they are set out as they are. So bringing together that knowledge and understanding that has come through the conduct of the surveys over the years, so that this isn't seen as some sort of prescriptive guidance, but really as an insight into of how to avoid the pitfalls that have been befallen previous surveys. And then the framework, as I say, for measurement. So deconstructing the concepts and explaining how the different questions within surveys can be used to construct indicators. So finally, just very briefly on the role that the guidance can have. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but just to show some of the potential. And the first is really to show that potential of the legal needs surveys, how they shed light far more broadly than just on the sort of core legal institutions and experience of law. Setting out best practice so that in future, there is more alignment, more harmony between questionnaires and surveys, and more possibility for comparative analysis, both within jurisdictions and across jurisdictions. A reference point for future discussions on the concepts and the methods, and of course, importantly, to inform the continuing debate around the measurement of SDG 16.3, and particularly ideas around measurement of access to civil justice. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Pasco, and I will put all that in the context of a very recent study, which Judge Kim implemented in Korea. Judge Kim, it would be great to hear what experiences you've had, with this approach of measuring access to justice, and how are you going to use the results in a way to address some of the shortcomings that you identified. So please.
Yes.
So
can I have my PPT?
Do we have the PPT? Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Korea, my beautiful hometown country. Today, I want to share Korean practice for making our Korean judicial system more responsive to people's needs. Actually, Korean judiciary conducted legal needs survey with OECD and OSJ I developed, which was just introduced by Professor Pascal. And it was very meaningful for us, so I will start there. My presentation has 3 contents: why and how Korean judiciary did a legal needs survey, and what we found from the survey, and then I hope to share what Korean judiciary are going to do next from the base of the legal needs survey result. So why and how Korean judiciary did a legal needs survey. We put 3 main purposes for this survey. First, we hope to find out users' legal needs and the problems of current judicial usage. I think legal needs survey is a very good way for measuring judicial system and making more responsive and effective to their practical needs. And also, we hope to make policy decision on adoption of timely legal aid service after analyzing the information from the survey. Furthermore, we Korean judiciary hope to contribute to the international effort with you for promoting access, justice, and sustainable development goal 16.3. So what was the background of the survey? We conducted the empirical survey through the legal needs, empirical study through the legal needs survey, as I mentioned. And diverse methods were used by the professional research agencies, such as face-to-face and online and email. And as I mentioned, we used a survey developed by OECD and OSJI. Actually, we used a draft version, the January version of this guidebook, and we included additional questionnaire from the research team. And we did a sampling of the survey with 4,400 respondents with 4 different groups. Group A was face-to-face survey, and Group B was online survey, and Group C was face-to-face survey with 1,000 visitors to Korean Legal Aid Corporation, and Group D was for online survey with lawyers and legal professors. And we did have research methodology, and we composed a very special research team with 2 renowned professors. One of them is Professor Sun-hee Kim, she is there here, and one SJD, and research agency. And also we thought training interview is very important to get accurate data. So the selected interviewers went through theoretical education and practical training before conducting the survey. And we did sampling with gender, age, location core sampling. And also this survey was conducted from March to May this year. So from the survey, what we found? Key findings 1. Experienced problems were generally similar among 4 different groups. I think this means that the survey was well conducted without any bias, and it shows that legal needs survey is a good way to find out what people's legal needs are. Key findings 2. The most prevalent experience of problems are in the following order: money, consumer debt, employment, family, housing, and others. And most serious problems are related to housing, employment, labor, and family. The above problems seem to occur generally in everyday life, so many people feel it is very serious to them. And key finding 3, there were a high percentage of people who tried to resolve the problem by communicating with the other party. And also, the percentage of people resolving the problem on their own were high in well-educated people and above middle-income classes. And what's the key findings for? Reasons for not seeking advice was concerns for the high lawyer's fee. And key findings 5, low perception on fairness. About 39% of respondents said the respondents said that the process was unfair. So we could recognize that level of access justice has much to do with the depth of confidence in the judicial system. And also, tracking the level of perception of people is meaningful because the final goal is to make the system good in their view, not from the provider's one. The last finding, we need to resolve stress. Across all the surveys, while dealing with the legal problems, stress was experienced the most. And also, levels of stress will improve the most after resolving the problem. Therefore, we need to handle the stress with legal problems simultaneously. So, what we are going to do next? Measure 1, using the survey result. Korean judiciary has the Judicial Development Commission with the people, which was established and operates under Chief Justice, and that deals with diverse judicial reform projects. And it consists of 11 members with judges, prosecutors, lawyers, professors, and others. When setting the agendas, it reflects public's needs that were drawn from the legal needs survey. And the commission actually adopted the agenda on enhancing access to justice in legal and non-legal procedure. And it has more plans on additional analysis of the survey result. Measure 2-1, Access to Justice Center. To efficiently provide the public with access to professionals and information, it is necessary to establish a centralized organization such as Access to Justice Center to resolve problems effectively. And when establishing the center, not only the courts, but the executive branch and professional organizations should jointly contribute. Measure 2-2, Psychological Service from Access Justice Center. The biggest issue, as I mentioned, that arises from experiencing legal problem is stress. Therefore, Psychological Counseling Center should be established under Access to Justice Center and should offer counseling on legal problems and stress in a more lighter setting. And by providing professional counseling and ways for cure, the visitors will be able to use the service to relieve their stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction that arose from the legal problems. Measure 3, establishing local mediation center. As a solution to meet the legal needs through mediation, we have a plan to establish the local mediation center at the community office. So the mediators will be assigned to the centers very close to the local citizens. So citizens will bring their dispute to the center to solve the problem through mediation, not through the litigation. So, and also the mediator may have the authority to ultimately settle the case. Furthermore, the process will be much shorter and cheaper, which helps citizens to go back to their peaceful life at an earlier stage. What's next? Treating the lawyer's fee problem. Because ordinary people do not know much about lawyers, the problem arises from the information asymmetry when they try to hire a lawyer. So many of them just go and find a high-profile lawyer. Therefore, providing diverse and detailed information about lawyers through a reliable institution would be a solution to the problem. Measure 5, enhancing the trust in the courts. Access to courts will be enhanced by identifying and offering ways to meet the legal needs, and this will ultimately lead to the recovery of the trust in the courts. We'll provide fair trial to everyone, regardless of having a lawyer or not, the lawyer was a former judge or not, by preventing any privileges associated with one's former post and by reinforcing the responsibility of the judges. The last measure, plans on additional analysis. We'll conduct additional research on the accumulated survey data to provide customized legal procedures for frequently experienced legal problems. And also we'll continue regular legal needs surveys in order to see whether the previous legal needs were met and to identify new legal needs. And also we'll keep trying to enhance access to courts to ultimately improve trust in courts, which will become the stepping stone for sustainable development. Now I have my last comment. Legal needs survey has been proved as a good tool for measuring justice and making the system more responsive and effective. Ultimately, it will lead to the successful achievement of access to justice and sustainable development goal. So in this regard, I want to give a big applause to OECD and OSJI, which released very fancy guidebook for us. And also one more thing, Korean judiciary also published a new book, very thick one, right? After we did our legal needs survey and then the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really impressive to see not only that you've done such a great study in such a short period of time, but how quickly you're turning the results into policy actions and how many actions you're taking forward. Really, congratulations to that. Our next speaker will really give us the perspective of how statistical agency has been incorporating legal needs measurement modules into its national survey tools. So Isabel, would it be great to really understand your perspective, why South Africa decided to do that, and what are the experiences and challenges of integrating civil justice measurement and access to justice more generally in other national tools? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm actually presenting the case of a country which doesn't have the exceptional growth rates of Korea. In fact, we currently technically have a recession. Our budgets are being cut left, right, and center, and yet our statistical needs are just increasing. So the focus of my presentation is really on, within this context, what is it that we did as a National Statistical Agency to expand our statistical collection in the case of access to justice. I think our starting point, as Zaza asked me to start with, was really the need to report on the National Development Plan progress. As you know, we have quite a well-crafted constitution which protects the rights of all citizens, and equality, inclusion is a very important part of that. However, in terms of statistical measurement, we have not really been measuring a lot and regularly in that space. And so we identified the need in 2012 to include in our current work program the measurement of governance statistics. And during that same time period, the SDG agenda was formalized, SDG 16 was formalized. And it actually dovetailed extremely well, and it also dovetailed very well with the work that this group, OECD and OSF, did in terms of measuring access to justice. And the first starting point that we had when we said, okay, we need to expand our governance statistics measurements, was to define what do we mean with governance statistics, because it's a very wide field and many people interpret it in different ways. And so I like to show this house, and it's roughly based on the concepts that UNDP and the World Bank include in the concept of governance. But it's now framed within our National Development Plan, and you'll see at the apex of our National Development Plan is the elimination of all forms of poverty and reduction of inequality. And this is not money metrics poverty, it's actually an all-inclusive, very broad-based interpretation of what poverty means. And then you'll notice at the bottom, the foundation of the house includes all the concepts that we want to include in our government statistics system. Legitimacy, voice, and equity. Here we talk about discrimination, exclusion, direction, leadership, governance. This morning we spoke about the need for strong leadership. Government effectiveness and performance, and then rule of law, where we also include civil and criminal justice, access to justice, accountability, transparency. And so the concepts in the foundation are really what all the speakers before me have already highlighted as elements or different aspects of access to justice. And we hope that by increasingly measuring access to justice regularly, we'll be able to feed into this debate and the decisions and the policies that are geared towards meeting the needs in our National Development Plan. Okay, the sequence of events is we had our medium-term strategic framework, and we identified we have to do something about governance statistics. We started with a consultative process. And at the end of all of that, it was both national and international consultative process. We decided that all we can really do, given our financial considerations, we could re-engineer our Victims of Crime survey. And at that point, we were doing an annual Victims of Crime survey collected continuously throughout the year. And we decided, let's then take this tool, re-engineer it so that we can look at civil justice, we can look at people's experience of discrimination, we could look at people's perception about trust in government, people's perceptions about how effective the government is doing its job, etc., etc. And so we've gone through quite a process of testing, and in April 2018 we actually rolled out what we call year one of our governance, public safety and justice survey. Our first report, hopefully before September 2019, and then we can hopefully share some interesting information and data. I just want to very, very briefly, Jeff, how much time do I have left?
You have however long Zaza will let you have.
He has been also keeping time, so, so I'm asking him. Anyway, so I think what may be nice for the audience to just look at is how we've subdivided the different concepts of governance into the 3-year rotational cycle that we're following. In year one, we do human rights, courts, experience of disputes, experience of victimization. In year two, we're looking at the capable state, trust in institutions, corruption, and again, experience of victimization. So the statistics that we've generated about victimization rates will be collected every year, but just with different modules added in front of it. And then in year three, we'll do a traditional victimization survey where we focus a lot on experience of crime. Because we are using an existing survey instrument, it's fully funded, and we do a sample of approximately 30,000 households annually. For the section on access to justice, civil justice specifically, we do have a randomly selected individual of 16 years and older in the household that respond to those questions. Certain parts of the questionnaire is done by the head of the household, but the access to justice module specifically 16 years and older. We use a recall period of the past 2 years, and we specifically look at the nature of disputes during the past 2 years. And here we've leaned heavily on the material that was developed by this group. And I must say, as people who specialize in household questionnaire surveys, I would say access to justice is one of the most complex and difficult things to measure. So it's not a joke, and we have been benefiting greatly from the work that's being done. So the questionnaire that's currently in the field, and this is my last slide, Zaza. Basically, on the right, you'll just see experience of disputes and problems. That's basically the way in which access to justice is measured by the experts. On the right, that's the randomly selected individual. And here we just give recognition to everybody who's contributed in terms of the expertise and experience. We've experimented a lot, and I think people interested in National Statistical Office, specifically interested in measuring this, are welcome to contact us. We tested, we made mistakes, we learned from the experts, and I think it's well noted that it's not a joke to collect this data. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella, and it's so important, of course, to institutionalize the measurement, you know, for statistical agencies to incorporate the components of it is one of the ways this measurement will be, you know, the recurrent and continuous. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences with this. So Jeff, so coming to you, it would be great to get your perspective from kind of how governments and civil society are using various kinds of data, including from legal needs surveys, but other data, to put them in policy change field. So how can they effectively leverage change policies and practices on the ground? So it would be great to get your perspective from Australia on that. And 8 minutes. Thank you.
That'll take us to Phil. Thank you, Zaza. Thank you to Statistics Korea, and thank you to the OECD for the invitation to be here. I will, as the last speaker, I've always anticipated I'll have to be flexible and adapt, and I shall, and jump to certain things. First of all, my organisation, it's a strange organisation. We are a statutory body within New South Wales that I think by mistake in 2000 was given the responsibility to identify the legal needs of the community from the people's perspective, what programs are effective to address them, and to support, I guess, a fair and equitable justice system. I think it might have been an accident, but nevertheless, we set about it. And we started off, and I'll jump quickly through here because of time. We started off looking at the question of legal need. What actually are the legal needs of the community, and from people, from their perspective, not just from the court, judiciaries, the legal system's perspective. We started off first of all looking at because there was a general narrative that people go to legal assistance services, to legal aid, and they're getting their needs met. That was the general perspective about 20 years ago. And so we actually went and started to collect what they call administrative data from those services to see what it would tell us about who goes, what sort of problems and so forth. We also did some targeted qualitative studies looking at certain disadvantaged groups. But about that time, there was Hazel Genn in the UK, and with an offsider called Pascoe Pleasance, they started to do some legal needs surveys, and we thought that might not be a bad idea. And so we started a process of doing some legal needs survey work. We did a pilot, then we did a small one in New South Wales in our state, and that really became a game changer. And I just throw this one slide up there which showed you from those first state-based results, and it suddenly showed us that in fact the majority of legal problems weren't actually being dealt with by legal assistance services. In fact, they weren't near legal advisors or legal systems at all. And in fact, if you took friends and relatives who were lawyers out, you had a very small proportion of people actually addressing legal problems that way. That prompted national legal aid commissions to actually fund us to do a national survey, which we did. Over almost 21,000 people interviewed. In those days, you could do landline. We couldn't do it now. And allowed us to do in-depth analysis by each state and territory, and it in fact became transformational. I will just quickly flash through so you can have some numbers to the general points that have been made very clearly by everyone before me. We found that half the population had at least one problem a year, but some have many. In fact, the greater the number of indicators of disadvantage you had, the greater number of legal problems you had as a general perception. About 9% of the population had 2/3 of the problem. And people with a disability, single parents, unemployed people, and people living in social housing had a large number of those, high vulnerability. We found that probably around, certainly in Australia and probably elsewhere, the media is always talking about crime. Around election time, it's all about crime and justice and security. Well, in fact, we find that, in fact, that's not one of the greater legal issues that confront people. Civil justice problems are. And we found, again, that people don't often go to legal service providers to resolve some of these problems for a range of reasons. In fact, they get their help from a range of bodies, not just, leaving aside friends and relatives, financial advisors, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, newsagents, government advisors, police, teachers. And we found, of course, that only a very small number, about 3.4% of matters were resolved in or near a court or a tribunal. So those matters that are there, many of them are very, very important, of course, but only very few were. Now, this had a major impact in Australia into the legal system. The survey had we call it a paradigm change in many ways, at least amongst the legal assistance services. That's been driving matters. We published a report, Pascoe was involved in that, Reshaping Legal Assistance Services, and that's been heavily guiding the way that legal services, legal assistance services have been shaped lately. The Australian Productivity Commission, which is the government's principal economic think tank, has recommended that we do a survey every 5 years, and it's driving the funding and arrangements for all of our legal aid, legal assistance services now. But actually identifying legal need is only part of the question, and we're now moving on to the broader system. So we've discovered that the legal needs survey is very important because it provides that representative sample of the population, if you sample it that way, and you actually get understanding from the people's perspective what the problems they face are. We found that administrative data that is not so good because it only is limited in a sense that it will tell you only what services are provided as opposed to what the needs are. But you also need to know where that need is, and that's where we have done a range of things, and I'll just mention it to this audience because you might be interested. We've developed some indicators, what we call the need for legal assistance services indicators, where we've taken the insights from the survey combined with those key factors of disadvantage using official statistics, data from census, to develop some indicators which we call National Need for Legal Assistance Services, which then can be mapped across the country. You can also, we do the same with criminal data and other data, which I'll just move on for the sake of speed. What works though? Okay, you know what the need is. What works to address those needs? Well, that's one of the great, I think Pasco and I think Marcus and I think Zaza have made the point that traditionally law and justice systems have not been the scene of a lot of evidence-based research analysis, and that's absolutely the case. And so what works? What works for whom, in what context, and cost effectively and sustainably is a question that we don't have enough answers to. We have I'm not going to go through this framework, but we are currently at the Foundation working with Marcos's staff, I hope he knows that, to develop a proposal for funding for outside bodies to go forward on this work in this framework. You must tailor your services and need to deliver them where they need to be. And again, this is where, I guess I call it the pièce de résistance, I suppose, where we bring together survey data, we bring together the insights from that with our official statistics data to give that need for legal assistance, and then we can map against that where the services are actually being delivered. And that gives some insight as to, are you reaching people in the right place at the time. So that whole model of, that sort of circular model is where we need to be going, and I'll leave with this last slide, and I'll ask the first speaker, because Canada and Australia are so similar, to say that I wish you would speak to your counterpart in the Australian government, Nathalie, about the importance of monitoring and research, evaluating all of the things that you do to make sure they're having the impact that they do, because we need to do more of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to all speakers. Now we've got about 14 minutes for questions, comments. Sorry, I should have been a bit more stricter. I was hoping we would leave 25, 30 minutes, but at least we have 14. So any reactions from the audience? Please, let's start with the gentleman over there and then come this way. So is there a microphone or, yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, members of the panel. My name's Mike Salvaris, and I'm from an Australian project called the Australian National Development Index. And we have 12 domains of progress, including justice. And I'm interested to hear your reactions to our approach to how we want to measure justice, because having been a lawyer myself in legal aid for quite a while, I know that there's been an emphasis on legal need, and it's a very crucial one, and I think that goes right back in our country to the poverty inquiry in the 70s, when Ron Sackville did one. But the question that we're trying to set is, how is the justice system serving equity and sustainability and well-being? And it's a slightly different question, and maybe much harder, because measuring legal aid it's a phenomenon that you can identify. You can ask people questions about unmet legal need and access to courts and so on, crucial questions. But the higher level question of, is the justice system as a whole serving society in this way? Is it living up to its own principles? Is it creating a more equitable, sustainable society, which has to do in part with access, but also lots of other things? So I just would like to ask you that question, if I may.
Yeah, no, thank you. So let's take 2 more questions, and yeah, and then we'll come to you afterwards. Yes, please. Yes.
Hello, my name is Goran Mitrovic. I come from a human rights NGO community in Serbia. Well, I have a question for Judge Kim. If I understood correctly, your survey focused on judiciary system, on examining people's experience with judiciary. Is that correct? Yes, okay, I understood correctly. I'm wondering why did you decide to focus only on judiciary when we know that one's perception of access to justice is much broader issue and it depends on services provided, for instance, by the state. And also I'm curious, how did you make sure that actual respondents, subjects in the survey had any direct contact with the judiciary, especially those information collected over the internet? Thank you.
Thank you. So let's have one more question.
Marco Miradercole from the OECD Statistics. My question is about what should be done to ensure the take-up now that these guides exist. Because you were saying, Zaza, at some point you said, no, we did one of the goal of the report is to make a counter-argument against those who were saying in the context of the SDG discussion it can be measured. Now we know that it can be measured, but it's not because something can be measured that the statistical officer will take it up. So in a sense, how do we go the extra step? There will be, as Pascal knows, there will be a chapter on access to justice in the forthcoming report of the UN prior group on governance statistics, so it is an important step. Statisticians will know that it can be measured, but should we not think about intervening on the demand side? After all, it should be a responsibility of the Ministry of Justice, that it should be an obligation for them, in a sense, to finance the data and the evidence that is needed to assess how well they operate is routinely produced. So is there anything that could be done on that side, not so much on the statistical side, but now on the demand side of the justice system?
Thank you, Marco, for the question. Any other questions, just to look at the audience? Because, yes, let's take one more, and then I think we have then time to respond.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for the panelists for your presentations. I'm Luis Calle from the National Statistical Office of Peru. So from the statistical perspective, in a summarized way, you have mentioned that an important aspect regarding to the need of make evidence-based decisions, which obviously includes the improvement of system of justice. So as part of this effort, I think that government must have a reliable, comparable, statistical information that can also be used by international organizations such as your OECD. So in that sense, one important aspect is the standardization and harmonization of statistics. My question is there a joint initiative between your agencies, OECD, with UNODC? Because they are actively working with the implementation of ICCS, that is the International Classification of Crime. So they also are working with the victimization service. So what is obviously this victimization service is also conducted for public ministries or statistical institutes. So in order to comply, of course, the Goal 16. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeff, why don't we start with the first question, and maybe on the first question, it would be great to get perspectives from other countries. I wonder if Pascal and Natalie would like to respond to the first question as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I might verge a little bit onto the others, or at least one other question as well. Look, that's a very good question, and I think it reveals how under-theorised and underdeveloped the whole evidence approach to justice is. And, I think for good reasons. For too long, justice systems have been a bit taboo, I think, as Mark has said, because it was all about independent judiciary. If you look at, CEPEJ, for example, which is the Europeans' efficiency of justice or biannual report, it focuses heavily on, superior court judges and prosecutors and appointments and superannuation schemes and all these things. There's a few pages on access to justice and legal aid. And that's generally the case too, I think, in Australia. Often the things that are measured are those high-level things, which the Legal Needs Survey, I think, would call into question that in fact that's where the focus should be. But I think in terms of those broader questions, how do you actually come up with some sort of measures that are there? Well, I think we've still got to work on that, that actually means something. But I think Jeffrey Sachs's point about not governance, but he said on statecraft, his first point was rule of law, equal access and so forth. I think too often rule of law is narrowly interpreted as being that judges and courts and so forth, whereas I think what we find is that in fact most people actually don't want to go to court. They want things resolved in other ways and so forth. And so I think that we had a much broader understanding about what justice is, what access to justice is, and how we deliver that, and how people can be empowered and so forth to respond. I think we're very much at an early stage. That is, okay, let's first of all get the systems to recognise that there's deficiencies here, that in fact, we're spending millions of dollars to facilitate, wealthy people to argue over, which Reinhardt family member gets which $1 billion, whereas you and I would have to compete for, means and merit tests to even get a few $100s worth of legal aid assistance. So we need to get that fundamentally turned around by, I guess, the understanding about this. And I think that understanding the rule of law must be considered much more broadly in terms of access to justice and meeting the day-to-day legal needs of people, and not just access to those superior courts. Very difficult question. I think that philosophically probably touches on some of the other questions. In terms of Marcus's question of in relation to getting take-up, I think that's very important. In Australia at the moment, the Legal Needs Survey actually has a very important place now in terms of funding. That is not necessarily being as effective at getting more money, which is what we'd like, but in terms of now of how the state and Commonwealth governments divide up the money amongst them and for different services. And so that there's a new move of tendering. Community legal centres are having to tender for their services, and they have to come up with evidence for why they should get funding based on sort of legal needs survey work and our legal needs thing.
For the sake of time, maybe we just follow the order and the sitting, and then the comments that you would like to offer, Isabel, and then Judge Kim.
Okay, I'm just going to make a very short comment. We found that, yes, there was a comment that the Department of Justice should pay for a survey like this. We actually found that our legal aid system is quite well developed and well functioning, but we found that by opening the conversation about how do we measure ideals of the National Development Plan, we actually, in a sense, created a demand which they knew existed, but they had so many other priorities and so much else to do that it was never crystallized as a need. And when we faced certain postponements in actually executing our survey, we ended up with stakeholders that were extremely upset with us. And so I think it's a two-way street. I don't think National Statistical Agency should wait for the Department of Justice to come to say, we need this survey.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for your good question, gentlemen. I think I was given two questions. First, why did we focus on just judicial systems? The answer is very simple, because I'm working for the judiciary, and within the small budget, we should focus on the judicial system, and also we hope to find out the solution, exact solution, what we should change directly. So, however, I think your question is very important, and also I do agree with you. We need to cooperate with other branches like executive branch and study groups. So maybe in the future, we could cooperate with other branches, and we could get more broad data, and we can find more solutions to our whole society. That's my first answer. And for the second question, what kind of effort we did for the accuracy of the data? I think, as I mentioned, for our study, we did use our OECD and USCAI developed questionnaire. That was our basic module. And if you look at this questionnaire, there are very detailed examples. The examples of dispute, and also there are illustrative examples and some detailed explanation about the dispute. And so we also put those examples, and sometimes we added the definition of the legal terms, because the ordinary people, sometimes they don't understand what does it mean, the legal terms. So we tried our best to explain the question itself. So oh yes, that means we want to be sure that the respondents to fully understand what the question is. So that's what we did for the accuracy of the data. Thank you.
I think just drawing on some of the themes that came from the different questions and re-emphasizing a point that Jeff was stressing, that the legal needs surveys, I mean, they don't exist in isolation. They complement, I mean, one of the great benefits of the surveys is that they provide a big picture that demonstrates the links and relevance, both going narrowly so that you can situate the data that comes from formal systems, formal justice system, the administrative data, but also those sort of broader links across and between the different domains and interests of government and public services. So the legal needs surveys, I like to sort of conceptualize them as providing something of a map, but it's important to be able to zoom in on different regions of the map, and in order to do that, then you have to be looking to other sources of data. But without a map, you don't know, you can't see how the various isolated aspects link to each other. So I think that is, first and foremost what the role of the surveys is.
Thank you, Zaza. Perhaps I will just focus on the question from our colleague from Peru. Yes, hopefully at the end point we have enough of a critical mass that surveys. Those surveys have to be tailored to specific needs of a jurisdiction. So you cannot, you cannot force them into a cookie cutter type of process. But I think that's the role of this guidance here. If we have enough of commonalities between those surveys. Ideally, yes, indeed, link it up to the UN processes, but from our contribution to the OECD, what we hope to do is that in the future, you may be familiar with our publication on government at a glance that we produce every 2 years. Hopefully, as a first step, if we have enough of a critical mass, we can start introducing some benchmarking into that publication, and that may lead to more of a take-up going forward. Thank you, Zaza.
Thank you.
Thank you. So regarding the kind of indicators and why are we only measuring legal needs and not the other aspect, it has been my dream for many years to have an instrument to convince politicians on what are the impacts if you don't invest properly in access of justice. So we have tried to develop a study, but it was studying the emptiness. So when you don't do something, what are the impacts of not doing something? So this is very difficult to measure. So I think that if collectively we are using those studies or survey regarding legal aid, we will be able to measure and to do some gap analysis amongst ourselves on how our country have vibrant economy, vibrant democracy, when they have access to legal services, and what are the consequences if they don't have access to legal services. So I think this is how we will be able to really bring the connections between well-being and access to justice. So that was my first. And I would like to finish in insisting a little bit of what have been said before. It's the poor level of legal literacy that most of our population is facing. So it's really difficult for them to know what they don't know. And when they don't know about the legal issue, they don't know where to start to get the basic legal information they are looking for. So this is really the challenge that most of us are facing in serving our citizens in their day-to-day life. And I'm sure that in many of the countries, we do have a network of NGOs, a network of public organizations, public agencies that offer legal services or at least legal information to their citizens. but our own citizens don't even know how to get this information. I'm sure you have experienced going to Google on their how to do something, but we don't have something as practical as that when it comes to access to justice. So we really have to put ourselves in, clients to develop instruments that will be client-centric and making sure that they can get access to information wherever they are and whatever situation they are facing.
Thank you very much. The challenges are tremendous. If you even look at the SDG framework and Access to Justice for All 16.3, it doesn't have civil justice indicator, which really talks about all. It only talks, the two indicators that were established. One deals with victimization, and the other one with detention, unsentenced detainees rates in criminal justice system. So only two criminal justice indicators. Civil justice is entirely missing. So with all the data that we were presenting, you can see, how much the majority of population is missing from 16.3 as such. So there is a long way to go, and to really build evidence, build practice. Of course, countries are doing work in this field, like Canada, Korea, Australia, South Africa, and others, but more needs to be done. So to the question about also the DC and then what's being done, one of the steps that is being done currently is that under prior handbook of governance statistics has a chapter on access to justice, and UNODC, OECD, and OSJI are co-leads of the chapter. So we have an opportunity to actually cover both criminal and civil, because historically the problem has been that UNODC is only dealing with criminals. So there is, and under UN, there is no custodian on civil justice. There is no civil justice data at all. So actually hope is on OECD and civil society and others who can maybe globally start talking about civil justice data, because we don't have that. So there is no comparable data. So we have to start somewhere. I think today was one of the starting points in a long way to go together. But critical elements to that is going to be that we have to really do this together with all other sectors under the broader rubric of well-being and better government and a trust. Those are the concepts that should really mobilize justice community as part of the all other communities committed to that. Thank you very much. Please join me to give a round of applause to our audience, to our panelists, and thank you for participation. And then now, as this session is over, please enjoy your lunch. Thank you.